counties. And as you get into the counties outside of Chicago, masks don't seem to be anybody's habit. So it's a very difficult time. And despite the incredible spread of the disease. About the election, well, I'm happy that Biden won because it means we get rid of Trump. But somebody told me a wonderful story the other day about giving a party, and it gets into the evening and they decide they ought to have something to eat. And some people vote for pizza and some people vote for killing the host and eating her. and the problem is that even though pizza won, you still have a big problem, you know. So we still have a big problem, and it's in a weird way, Trump has resurfaced all the worst of American attitudes and behaviors. So, you know, xenophobia, racism, white supremacy, you know, incredible narrow-mindedness, and a kind of permission given to stupidity that's totally frightening.
Yeah. It's interesting. Well, of course, misogyny as well, among other things.
Misogyny, absolutely, too. Yeah. You're right.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if I often feel that the Civil War never ended, you know, that or it ended, but not quite the way it should have, and that these tensions have been with us for the past 150 years or more, you know.
In one way or another. I mean, you know, the Constitution, which wasn't divinely inspired by God, but written, you know, in an effort to keep the slave states in the Union.
Yeah.
So a whole lot of what we're dealing with, including the Second Amendment and the Electoral College, are left over from that desire to accommodate slave owners. Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's you know, the worm was in the apple from the very start, so to speak. You know.
Right. No, that's America's original sin.
Yeah.
And it has never really gotten away from it. You know, it's a lot has happened that's worthwhile, but we're still in a system which privileges land over people. Yes. You know, so you'd have to do the math to figure out how many people need to represent one senator in Wyoming as opposed to New York or Illinois. It's crazy. It's simply crazy.
Right. So, yeah. Well, it's so good to have you. And I want to just, I mean, you know, you've had a distinguished career as a poet and fiction writer, essayist, and professor. And so I think this is a rare opportunity to talk to someone who's been on the scene for so long and who knows so much about the literature scene of America, the literary scene of America, and the world for that matter. But you grew up in Nebraska. Could you tell us a little bit about your upbringing?
Well, I grew up in a three language household. My mother was from Germany, my father's Italian, and so we had three languages. Okay. German, which is a weird dialect of German nobody else speaks, and then Southern Italian, my father's dialect, which nobody else speaks, and then English, which survives in me. I'm not as fluent in those languages as I might be because I grew up during the Second World War, and they were both only spoken in the house at night. Because otherwise it would suggest an affiliation with the Germans and the Italians who were on the Axis side. Anyway, so the fortunate thing about my life is not just the language part, but when I was 3, we moved into a housing project in the Black Ghetto in Omaha.
Okay.
And then for peculiar reasons, which may have to do with being Italian, that housing project was divided by a street that ran through the middle of it. And on the east side of that street, the projects were white. And on the west side of that street, the projects were black. And I grew up on the west side of that divide. Okay. So I lived in an African-American world. I went to a probably 50% African-American grade school, maybe a 35% African-American high school. My friends included always African Americans. I mean, I just lost two of my childhood heroes. Bob Gibson,
Oh, yeah.
who I played baseball with, although not anything like at his level. Josh Gibson, his brother, was our coach,
Oh, wow.
and Gail Sayers, who
Oh,
was in my sister's class. He's younger than I am,
yeah.
but and his brother Roger, who I knew.
Was Gail
But they were
still living in Chicago? Was he living in Chicago when he passed? Or
no, he was back in Nebraska, but he had Alzheimer's at the end,
oh,
and
okay.
Gibson died of pancreatic or liver cancer, pancreatic cancer, I think. But that was just a few weeks ago.
Wow.
Anyway, that's a part of my past, which was in an odd way, it was simply my life.
Yeah.
And I never actually thought of it as being underprivileged, although I was poor and I became a communist early on.
Yeah.
But that was based on the fact that my mother told me that the communists were going to divide up everything equally. And since I had nothing, I decided it was a really good plan. But
The fact that
so I had an interesting life. I mean, in terms of music, Omaha was an interesting place for music. My friend, one of my friends is a wonderful trumpet player. I wanted to play jazz. I wasn't good enough. I mean, I was a trombone player, but I wasn't capable of thinking in music. I could read along and play as side work, but I couldn't play jazz. And that was my friend Maureen Hunter. Her uncle was Lloyd Hunter, who had a traveling swing band. Her other uncle was Preston Love, the great saxophone player who played with Ellington and Count Basie. Preston's son, Preston Jr., was in my brother's class in grade school. But that, and Buddy Miles, I was thinking about the other day, who I knew when he was a child prodigy. His mother called him Buddy because Buddy Rich was a child prodigy, but Buddy Miles played drum solos when he was like 6 years old.
This is a Buddy Miles who became famous later with Jimi Hendrix, of course.
Right, he played with Hendrix and he played with Carlos Santana.
Yeah.
Yeah, he died in Austin. I didn't know he was living here until his death was shortly after. He died shortly after we moved here, and I didn't know that he was living in Austin. But I knew his parents.
It must have been about 12 years back or so, wasn't it? Or
yeah.
I thought. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, that explains one thing about you, which is why you're so cool. You know, you grew up around Black people, and
I grew up.
You claimed us, and we claimed you. So.
Yeah, right. Well, the other thing Maureen and I always talk about is the fact that when I was a kid, Italians weren't considered entirely white.
Yeah.
There's a piece in one of the poems I wrote. My grandfather says to me, never call the police, and don't trust white people.
Okay.
And he made a distinction between Italians and other white people.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that reminds me of the Richard Pryor joke I posted on Facebook some weeks ago, where Pryor says that not all Italians are in the mob, only 90% of them.
Yeah, right.
But in any case.
Well, my grandfather was one of those guys, and my father and my uncles all worked in when they were kids in his bootlegging business.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So jazz, it seems to me, has figured in your career as a poet, certainly, and we'll come back to that. But to some degree, you deal with your childhood in the novel, your one novel, The Red Menace.
The Red Menace, yeah.
So, what is it like to? I mean, let me ask it this way: why write a novel as opposed to a memoir? What played into your decisions at the time in terms of that?
I wanted a degree of invention that I suppose a memoir wouldn't have given me. And the novel is really not about me. I mean, I'm at the center of it.
Yes.
But it's really about all the smart people in the novel are other people. So somebody's always lessening, to use a North Side word, lessening me, right? So there's the dishwasher in the hotel named Whiskey Nose Louie, and he's enormously smart, if incredibly profane. There's a guy, an actual guy, who was one of the owners of the A&A Music Company named Emmett, who gives me a lesson about white girls, right?
Okay. Yes.
But so I'm always getting lessons from other people. And then the other thing is that I wanted the freedom of the invention involved with those kids who made up reality by argument, right?
Okay.
So, they get to be in charge of reality by deciding, what's the most interesting story.
Yeah. It does seem like setting has a important place in all of your work. Is there, maybe I can ask you this way, do you think there's a Nebraska literary tradition? I think of, I know my friend Teresa Boda, for example, grew up in Nebraska. I wonder about others. I know, wasn't Langston Hughes from Lincoln?
Oh, Langston Hughes was from was originally from Illinois, I think, Southern.
Oh, okay.
Well, there wasn't much of a tradition when I was there. I mean, at one point, a newspaper, I was in college, wanted a comment on the beat poets. And they asked Carl Shapiro, who was the very famous, Pulitzer Prize winning poet at the University of Nebraska, and me, and I was an undergraduate. Okay. So there wasn't a big literary world at that point. There was some interesting stuff. Black Elk, the Native American, whose words were transcribed by a poet named Nyhard.
Yeah.
That's a part of the Nebraska tradition, and of course, Willa Cather is a part of that tradition.
Willa Cather, right?
So Willa Cather brooded over me, so I decided not to pay any attention to her. But I didn't want to be a Nebraska poet, or I never really wanted to be a Chicago poet. I just wanted to be a poet and take advantage of what was around me.
Yeah.
So Chicago's more important to my career, I think, than the first two books. The Color of Dust is largely about Nebraska. There's some Chicago poetry in there, and then River Songs, that series of 10 poems is about Nebraska and Lewis and Clark.
Yes.
But most of my work was written in Chicago.
Yeah. So what brought you to Chicago, and when did you come?
I went to Chicago. I went from Nebraska to Buffalo, and then I left Buffalo to teach at Northwestern in 1965. And I stayed at Northwestern for a few years, and then I was hired at what became UIC, which Buffalo, was then called.
If I could ask, Buffalo didn't have the reputation for a place for experimentation, did it, or had it already?
Well, while I was there, the department, I had finished all my work. And then the department changed. Albert Cook came, brought Charles Olson, and a whole raft of other people. So in my last year there, when I was doing my dissertation, I attended the Charles Olson seminar. Okay. And I just wrote, there's an essay about to come out about that called When Buffalo Became Buffalo. But I was there for the end of that. But when I was in coursework in the department, it was an extremely traditional English department without even not much attention to American literature and no courses in modern. Okay. So all my coursework was medieval, Shakespeare, 17th century, Milton, those things.
Okay, I see. Right, and then you said you went from Buffalo to Northwestern.
Yeah. Yes. So I taught at Northwestern. And then in 68, I went to what became UIC.
Okay. What was the Chicago literary scene like when you arrived in 68?
Well, that group of people associated with Paul Carroll and Big Table had sort of broken up.
So Paul Carroll, for those who don't know, was one of the beat poets.
Right. Well, he was a kind of anthologist of poetry. And he had for a while a press in Chicago called Follett. But he had become famous for a magazine called Big Table. And he was going to publish a lot of beat literature in the Chicago Review. and it was censored by the University of Chicago. So he started something called Big Table, which made him famous. But anyway, he had been involved with a group of poets, including with John Logan as the teacher, a private workshop downtown Chicago. Okay. And that broke up just as I was getting there. But Marvin Bell, Charles Simic, William Hunt, Bill Knott, a whole group of people were really considered to be famous poets, were a part of that program. That had sort of ended. Carl Shapiro was there teaching at UIC, which I finally ended up with his job when I went there because he left that year and went to California. John Nims was there. There were a handful of poets on the South Side, but it wasn't anything you noticed particularly. Poetry Magazine, of course, was there, the Chicago Review. Charles Newman had just that year started the new version of Tri-Quarterly, which would become the sort of major magazine in the world in its period. Yeah. So things were cooking, you know. So I got to get to the pot while it was boiling.
Okay, that's terrific. And then, of course, there was also, I guess, starting at that time, there were the writers who associated the Black Arts movement with the
Obasi, yeah. Well, Obasi, yeah, I learned about Obasi because of several friendships. Well, with Gwendolyn. Gwen and I were friends early on. We met maybe in my first year in Chicago. I met Gwen and Henry, huh?
Gwendolyn Brooks, yes.
Gwendolyn Brooks.
Yeah.
And then, you know, because Angela Jackson, I knew when she was a student at Northwestern, and she was an Obasi person. And then I suddenly forgot, Hoyt Fuller, who was the editor of what became Black World, yeah, which was before that called the Negro Digest.
Right.
And a whole lot of interesting people were published in there even before Hoyt got there. But Hoyt changed it to Black World, and it became much more involved with Black arts and revolutionary thinking, okay, in the 60s.
I guess I should say now that at the University of Illinois at Chicago is where I met you. I guess it would have been probably 40 years ago.
Oh, yeah, at least, yeah. Well, I think you were all of 19, maybe, when we met?
I was 18, actually.
18.
Barely. And
one of your interests in those days, which is, I guess, come back recently, was science fiction.
That's true. That's true. I had never read literature because I didn't know that it existed. So until I went to college at UIC, but eventually I took classes in both poetry and in fiction. Even though I started out as a fiction writer, and you were certainly one of my poetry instructors. And I remember a lot of the things that you said about poetry, and it seemed not just you, but Ralph Mills, who also taught in the program. You both had sort of particular ideas about what poetry should do and what it shouldn't do, or not necessarily what it should and shouldn't do, but the things that you liked and the things that you didn't like. And I remember one of the things that always stuck with me is you said in class once in one of the workshops, you know, it's cool to hang around poets because poets know things. You know?
Yeah, right. That's a kind of version of something Kenneth Koch once said in an interview. He said, somebody said, why are you poets in New York so much involved with painters? Yeah. And Kenneth said, they have money and give big parties, you know. But the nice thing about poets know things. It's good to be around poets. And the other thing is that it's hard to explain sometimes to non-writers, but the thing about every poet has his or her own curriculum, right? The thing about being a poet is you follow your nose, you know, there's some things we all share, and they're accidental sharings, but by and large, we each choose our own direction on the kinds of things we're going to be, you know, relate to in the history of poetry, but also in science and social, and, you know, anthropology, linguistics. We pick out what we want, and we follow those lines.
And that's certainly one of the aspects, I guess, what we would think of as modernism, and specifically modernist poetry. But a few minutes ago, you mentioned Kenneth Koch, one of the figures of the New York poets, the New York School of Poets. I often think of you as a member of the New York School. Would you categorize
Well,
yourself?
I never really wanted to be a part of a school. And Kenneth and Ashbery would both buck against that term New York School of Poets because it made them sound as though they were all alike, and they're really quite different.
Yeah.
The association I think you probably think of as my early relationship with Frank O'Hara.
Okay.
And the fact that I published a special issue of the magazine I edited in Buffalo called Audit of Frank O'Hara poets at a time when O'Hara hadn't had a major publication for about 7 or 8 years.
Oh, wow.
After Meditations in an Emergency, which had been published by Grove, he only had a couple of small artist editions, and then that book called Second Avenue, which is a really interesting book, but it was in a very, very small edition, less than 200 copies.
Wow.
So the magazine, in many ways, brought O'Hara back into general attention. He'd always been attended to in New York and by other poets, but that magazine published an issue of about 3,000 copies, and they all sold out. So it was a sort of restarting of his career and as a national figure.
That's more than what the average book of poetry sells today, which is.
Yeah. Well, my occasional friend Hans Magnus Enzensberger invented something called the Enzensberger constant, in which he said there are 1,365 readers of poetry in the world.
Okay.
If one dies, there could be another one. But so the problem is now the poetry has become so ubiquitous.
Yeah.
And you and I were at the AWP in Washington together, and I hadn't been to one of those in 20 or 30 years. And the proliferation of presses and various publications is dizzying. It's so that there are all of these writing programs, low res writing programs of one kind or another. So this habit of poetry, which I got onto early on, which made me feel like a sort of ultimate outsider in an organized world, now has its own universe, its own society, whatever.
Well, I can think back to when I was in school in the 80s and early 90s, and then I remember hearing you tell stories about readings in the 60s and 70s and how the readings were so sparse that whenever you gave a reading, you had a full house. I mean, it was, that's something like, which is hard to imagine these days, almost,
Yeah, we did some really spectacular readings at UIC in that period when you were there.
Yeah.
And I struggled to create and hold on to an audience for what, a period of 30 years. But in the 60s and 70s, well, I think that the fact is that people thought that we, that is poets, had the answer.
Okay.
We didn't have the answer, but we did really well with people thinking we did, So, I remember giving a reading on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, and the host walked me around the back of this building, and I walked into a science lecture hall expecting maybe 20, 25 students, and there were 300. It was just a kind of a canyon of knees looking at me, waiting for me to tell them the truth about American poetry. It was crazy.
Okay. Wow. Something else I wanted to mention that you said, you often talked about how writing a poem is a score, and just going back with the question of music, you said a poem, I teach this to my students, that a poem is a score. So the way you write the poem is the way you want the reader to read the poem, and the way you want the poem to be.
Yeah, the person who started thinking that way was William Carlos Williams. And among the first poems he sent to Poetry Magazine, to Harriet Monroe, were written as Williams' poems are, with an absolute attachment to the end of the line and what happens with the end of the line. And she changed the lines. And he wrote, and it's the first document of this, he wrote a very angry letter saying, how will anybody know how I want them to read the poem if you change the lines. And that was the first, the other people may have thought of it, but it was the first real articulation of what we think of as free verse and the relationship of music in free verse to the importance of the end of the line.
Okay.
And later on, he would invent in a triad, which I use all the time, a stanza that had a minor break and a major break.
Okay.
So, but that you play with that, and you play with the scoring is a good way to think about it.
Well, what's the difference between a major break and a minor break?
Well, in Williams, that three level stanza, there is a kind of pressure to get around the corner. Okay. Within the stanza that is not so great as the large corner between that stanza and the next stanza. Oh. So you actually have two kinds of rests. But then you're a musician, and you know that at the core of jazz, certainly, and blues music is more rest. That is the space within the song. Right. Is as important as the song.
I'm a failed musician, that is to say.
Well, so am I. My friend Maureen said to me quite famously when I was a kid and we were playing, there was a jazz combo, and I clearly didn't have the chops to play the trombone, which was my instrument, that I played the drums. And I could follow a beat, but I couldn't press it because I didn't know how to do that. Okay. And she said to me, Michael, I think you should go back to singing. That's what I did.
You have to make the beat swing, but
yeah, you have to advance the beat. And you have to move it back and forth. You can't just play along as you do when the radio's going and you're drumming your fingers on the tabletop.
Right. So that's jazz. Another thing I remember you saying is that you were against poets reciting poems, like during a public reading, poets who would recite poems from memory. And can you speak about?
Yeah, the famous one for doing that was Galway Kinnell, who had a big career for a while. I don't know if anybody reads him now.
Yeah.
But he would walk up to the table at the front of a reading. He'd open the book, and that's what he was going to read. Then put the book down and walk away from it. Okay. And recite it. One of the things I like to do, it's kind of a discipline. I probably now with 400 or 500 pages of poetry in print can't recite every poem I've written, but I used to be able to. But I refused to do that because I wanted to look at the score essentially, yes, and read the poem as it was on the page. Yes. And that people do different things, but that's my discipline.
Well, there's that other kind of parallel tradition of the the poet who sees the poem as a score, but then they like to improvise. So I remember my my friend Wanda Coleman talking about, a lot about how a reading was a performance, and sometimes she would hold the book out like this and sort of like showing for the audience, as she, or Miri Baraka for that matter, could write a really terrible poem, but
Well, the thing about Baraka, and we were friends way back, and then not, and then friends again. But the thing about Baraka is that he was so brilliant rhetorically,
right?
That at a conference, say, on a panel discussion, he won every time. Right. At one point, he was in Buffalo, and he was going to give a talk that night, and I said I was going to come down. He said, "Well, no, don't bother. I'm just talking to union guys. This is." But I did go down because I was fascinated by it, and it was amazing, just improvisationally brilliant rhetorician. He would have been the star of Athens in the 5th century. Okay. I mean, I suppose that's something of what you would have seen in Frederick Douglass, you might have seen in Lincoln, that incredible ability to shape an oratory on the spot.
Right.
And the last version of that you can see in Baraka is in that movie Bulworth, where he's kind of the stands for the Greek chorus,
right,
who moves around in that thing. But it does give you something of that flair that he had even outside of poems.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I was going to say because he he could read a bad poem, but the reading itself would be brilliant, you know. But just
Oh yeah, yeah,
but I suppose even someone like Barack Obama has some of that kind of Baraka thing in him, in terms
yeah.
of the oratory.
Well, and in terms of, well, also Obama's so good at pauses,
Uh,
right? He
right.
breaks up the sentence in ways that other people wouldn't break up the sentence. So when the Saturday Night Live was trying to do a version of him for their skits, that was the key thing,
Yeah.
was get those Obama pauses in the sentence. You know?
Okay.
It's terrific.
Right. That's all part of kind of like a comedian's timing as well. Baraka was very funny, also, you know, publicly, which is true also of Obama as well. I think, you know,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
humor. So,
Well, there's also the tradition of, you know, it's written about this in terms of Renaissance English writing, the tradition of pulpit oratory.
uh,
And in fact, pulpit oratory in African American culture is an enormously important feature of what's going on. And everybody was a reverend in the civil rights movement, right? Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, everybody, even Adam Clayton Powell had a theology degree in there someplace.
that's true.
And that tradition of pulpit oratory of I'm not comfortable with call and response, so everybody likes it a lot, but of that engagement with the congregation,
Yes.
uh, and that ability to engage the congregation at a level of charismatic oratory is something I read once with June Jordan. It was like reading with an express train, you know, boom, she goes straight by. I read a couple of times with Lucille Clifton, who didn't read with that kind of urgent speed, but had that really wonderful kind of contralto voice that she could move so easily through the poem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that sort of makes me think also of Leon Forrest, you know, the great Chicago writer who no one reads probably, but
yeah,
you,
I'd say for a brief time, well, Crouch just, died, and he was a huge fan of Leon's. And he would call Leon on the phone at night and say, "I found this new thing in Divine Days, and I want to tell
Stanley
you."
Crouch, you mean?
He tried, yeah, Stanley Crouch.
Right.
But Leon had one of the great voices. I think that Leon's books will come back.
Yes.
As it just requires time and effort to read them. But I mean, that last speech in There Is a Tree, the political speech the woman makes is one of the great declamations in American literature. It's absolutely dazzling. And then I used to teach in my fiction class, The Bloodworth Orphans, which is probably my favorite of that and Two Wings. But I think, Two Wings has this great scene where one of the characters is under the bed of another one. I mean, it's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, this is a way of speaking to, I suppose, Chicago literary tradition, and I wonder if the larger critical community thinks of there being a Chicago literary tradition. I've actually had some communications with a guy named I won't mention his name, but with a guy who writes about the neighborhood that I grew up in, South Shore. So he's writing critical work about writers from South Shore, So, but
well, I mean, James T. Farrell was from South Shore.
Right. But that's to say that some of the Chicago writers, like who was the guy who wore suits all the time, the fancy dresser, the black writer. He was a lawyer, I think, by profession. Cyrus Coulter.
Cyrus, I published Cyrus's books.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
You've done. That's another hat you've worn as a publisher, as an editor as well. So.
Well, Cyrus and Leon ended up on the Northwestern faculty together.
Oh, right. That's right.
Yeah. Well, we haven't mentioned Sterling Plump, who was my colleague and your teacher as well.
One of my teachers, yes, certainly.
Yeah, and one of the great ones.
Well,
and anybody who wants to learn about how to insinuate, I don't think you can match, but you could insinuate jazz into poetry should read Sterling.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I wanted to say one other thing about Leon Forrest. It's worth mentioning that Toni Morrison was his editor, and I believe you have a theory that that Toni Morrison. Actually, I've stolen this theory and I've given it to.
Well, I knew Toni in those days. She was an editor at Random House.
Yes.
She edited Leon's first two books.
Mm-hmm.
There's a Tree More Ancient Than Eden and The Bloodworth Orphans.
Yes.
She had already published the first of her novels, and she's a wonderful writer, and they're wonderful novels. But the kind of transposition of experience through language, and she had also done a master's degree on Faulkner. Leon was very attentive to Faulkner and as well, and Dostoevsky. But
right.
But that transformation of the net of experience through language, I think, she learned from Leon.
Yeah.
And there's nothing, you never study a writer more closely than if you're editing that writer.
Right.
So, because you could write an essay on a book you've read a couple of times. If you're the editor of a book, you're going to read it a dozen times, upside down and backwards, sideways, everything.
Right.
So I don't think it's shocking in any sense. Though, were you at that memorial? Well, it wasn't a memorial. The celebration of Leon before he died at the Art Institute.
No, I was not.
Yeah, John Weidman came, and everybody was there. And then I was charged with getting letters from people who couldn't come. James Allen McPherson, a variety of people. I called Weidman on the phone. He said, yeah, I'll write something. And then he called me back and said, I'm coming. So he came and he gave a great talk. It was wonderful. Oh. But I read these letters and I got in touch with Toni and she said, yes, she'd do it, but then she didn't. And so it's too bad.
Yeah.
But anyway, she, we all stand on the shoulders of giants.
Right, right. That was a phrase apparently that Leon had. According to Sterling, Leon would often say, "You have to throw your hat into the ring with giants." When you're writing that sense of competition, which I think is part of African American tradition, whether it's in music and like cutting.
Well, cutting on the dozens.
Sports, the dozens, and sports, basketball and baseball and so forth, football, and that's all.
Leon used to go down to the South Side to watch basketball players.
Yes.
Down on 95th Street. Yeah. And for variations, and Larry Neal used to talk about basketball as a jazz form.
Variation that's style, like Albert Murray says, style is the dancing of an attitude.
Right.
So each player has his own particular style. At least the best players develop their own style.
Well, and the best players, like the best players in jazz, the best players in basketball transform the game.
Yeah.
So the game in the era of Bob Cousy is totally different than the game when Clyde begins to play.
Right.
And then you get Dr. J, and Dr. J is the progenitor of Michael Jordan, in the same way Michael Jordan is of Kobe Bryant.
Right.
So there's all this complicated business of finesse. Well, in that piece I wrote for you, initially for that celebration of Sterling in Chicago, it's all about touch in the most subtle kind of way.
Yes, I see.
But we know that music proceeds from its practitioners.
Yes.
Not from theorists, but from practitioners, and that's true of basketball. Less so with football.
Well, this speaks to the whole way that I guess one of the things I'm trying to get at here is the whole way that African American culture has influenced American poetry, whether it be a Black poet writing a poem or a white poet writing a poem, or whether it be a woman writing a poem or a man. I don't think these distinctions really matter necessarily. do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, I think so much. If I, you know, I feel like so much of the criticism that we see, the scholarship is kind of ghettoized. You know, Black writers are only written about in the context of other Black writers and white writers and so on. Whereas, you know, as writers, we read across the boundaries, we read everything. And then particularly if we are interested in the importance of a culture, the importance of jazz, the importance of improvisation, you know.
Well, yeah, the jazz, of course, is the great influential art form of American culture.
Yes.
I mean, it's not merely a part of basketball, it's a part of poetry, it's a part of everything, it's a part of the evolution of music.
Yes.
And it is, in a very profound way, the way that freedom is exercised amid constraints. You know, you know, you can't be free in jazz. Why I didn't become a good player, you know, unless you're good. You have to be good. You have to think in music, but then thinking in music means that you are also always moving at the edge. That's why we are so attached to Charlie Parker, say.
Yes. Yes.
Because or of Coltrane, because they're always at the edge of what's available to them. And so it's a little bit like watching somebody dance on the corner of the galaxy or something. It's pretty amazing. But that sense of variation and freedom that it allows, and the degree to which it represents always an acquisition of cultures,
Right.
you know, from the start. Well, I wrote about Gottschalk, who you know about, the Creole Louisiana composer who went to Cuba and Haiti early,
Right.
and
Louis.
began to bring those rhythms back to his composition.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
And finally, for my interest, you know, so Chano Paso comes to America in the late 40s,
Right.
and it plays with Dizzy Gillespie, you know,
Yeah.
and you finally get the beginnings of Afro-Cuban stuff.
Right. Right. Yes, for sure.
But you get these renewals over and over again. It's amazing.
Yes. To change slightly, go different subject. One of your pet peeves is confessional poetry. I like the.
Oh, well.
Could you talk about?
You know, I don't think poets are that interesting, you know.
Okay.
I mean, the material of poetry is interesting. The experience is interesting.
Okay.
Whether somebody had a breakdown isn't interesting. And also, it's always been my feeling that poets are not, I mean, the worst elitism possible is the assumption on the part of poets that their feelings are more acute than anybody else's.
Oh, okay.
Actually, maybe be less so, right? Somebody dies and you decide to write an elegy.
Yeah.
And you start writing the elegy and suddenly you're competing with Theocritus, and then you got Milton in your sights.
Right.
And you're gonna knock off Shelley. You know, we're always involved with the poem rather than its subject. We're always advancing the poem rather than what we think of as its emotional content.
Okay.
And so there was a thing on the internet called A Brief History of Confessional Poetry. So I wrote one of my nasty rhyming poems about it. Slowly the poet, his way plods to take the place of heroes and of gods, right?
Right.
The ceremony of anguish is only joy, an Iliad of selves, a paper Troy. I can't stand it. It's but it's, and I would get students who'd say, I really love Anne Sexton's poetry because she is totally honest about her feelings. I said, I don't know if she's honest about her feelings. Read the damn poem,
Right. 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 I understand that. One other thing I'd like to just mention is that you said that I remember you saying that when you told your mom you wanted to be a poet, she started crying.
She cried. Well, I was in science. I was in science, right? I was the great white hope, and so I came back from a year of science studies, and I said, I'm not gonna be in science anymore. I'm gonna be an English major and write poetry. And she cried. Of course.
Yeah. It makes me think of the the time that you arranged to read it for me at the Arts Club of Chicago, and my mother.
Oh yeah, and Alice was there.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
My mother.
my wife was there too. Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, my mother worked for wealthy people in their homes, but she wasn't comfortable being in highfalutin settings. And I remember how you went out of your way to make her comfortable.
Yeah, no, Joanne sat with her through the whole thing and there was food at the back of the room. That was a great day, actually. The two times with her that were remarkable was also that reading we did together in Winnetka.
Right, in Winnetka. That's
when one of the couples she had worked for came to the
yes, that was the family she worked for the longest, in fact.
Yeah.
So
well, I always think about when you're living in South Shore, it must have taken her an hour and a half to get out there.
Yeah, it did, for sure.
Yeah.
And she sometimes she took a carpool, and sometimes she took the bus and then another bus and then the train.
Yeah, the train, yeah. God.
Sometimes she took the IC to downtown and then the other train and so on. So yeah. And
well, speaking of school, she whenever I saw her, well, other than when we visited her in the home, she was always colorful. So that night in Winnetka, she was wearing a purple outfit with purple shoes.
Right.
I think she got it for the occasion, you know.
Right. That's true. Yes. Well, I want to say that I just want to announce that there's an important book about your work that's coming out next year. It's called From the World to the Place, and it's edited by poet Leah Graham. It's been published by Mad Hat Press. That should be, I think it's coming out in March of next year, is it?
I think that's right, yeah.
So From the World to the Place, everyone should be sure to get the book, and everyone should be sure to discover your work if they don't know it, or discover it in greater context if they should like to do so. I thought we would end with you reading the two poems that are appearing in Taint Taint Taint.
Let me see if I can find them. One's the fire poem about Minneapolis.
Yes. Lights.
Let me. That came about because I was watching that, and I was thinking about Philadelphia and fire also, and the idea of fire as the where'd it go? Fire as the weapon of the unarmed. You know, hey, where did these poems go? Just a second. Too many poems, Jeffrey. Here it is. Oh, no, that's not it.
And the other poem is Strange Forms with Fancy.
Strange Forms with Fancy, right. I've got this whole pile here. Let's see where we are. This is confusing. Did they get moved? I'm sorry to be so disorganized. I'm sitting in my study here. All right, Strange Forms with Fancy and Northern Lights. I got it.
Yeah.
All losses are restored and sorrows end. Here we are. So this is called Northern Lights, Minneapolis 2020. Fire is the weapon of the unarmed. Anger is essential element. It dances into the night, their hands uplifted to it, arms in silhouette. Resembling the forms of dreams, they move, ancient and ecstatic, against the daily fear, against silence or muttered capitulations. And then Strange Forms with Fancy. But both these are related to this year's troubles.
Yes.
This is more COVID related. Trial and error. How is it we manage these days, all touch withheld from us? The cactus on my walk is budding its waxen buds. My mock orange is in full bloom. At some distance, peonies have pushed up through winter's crust. Glory of the snow is snowed in once again. Windflowers and scilla. Distance is marked by this season's urgencies. A handful of spring air, my dear. These changes we think of as time are directionless. Purpose an invention we have agreed to, the area under the green curve of leaf and stem, cloud and cloud shadow, moving in their own ways. A fistful of microbes, a deep breath counted out now, all that seems to be starting up again. The long evenings, bright reach ends, its ending, a meteor shower seen only as it extinguishes itself, ourselves, embers as well, quietly separate beneath the distant, slow, burning fires of the stars.
Well, thank you.
That's good.
Yes.
I'm excited by the magazine.
I'm excited too to be doing it. So it's a lot of work, but I think it's well worth the effort. So,
Yeah, Taint, Taint, Taint. Everybody should get it.
thank you.
And it'll be on the net. Is it going to be a paper too, or just the net?
Well, there will be a PDF available on the website for people who'd like to print it out.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Down the line, we'll actually do some print copies as well. But for
Well,
now,
Taint is a wonderful, wonderful title because it has so many valences going in so many directions.
right. You know, originally I was just going to call it Taint, but then I discovered that there had been a British magazine called Taint that folded some time ago. So Taint Taint didn't sound quite right. So I thought, well, three taints does.
Three taints, but there are at least three different meanings of taint. One that's fairly associated with the body,
Right.
which is great fun, and then it has a contraction.
Yes.
Taint no difference to me, right?
Right. And then there's the cork smell from the wine.
Right.
And then, of course, you have the whole tainting, the dirtying or the sullying of something.
Sullying of things, right? So, yeah, I think three, at least, meanings of taint. Good.
I also think about taint nobody's business if I do.
Taint nobody's business but my own, right?
The Bessie Smith and so on. So,
yeah.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thanks for joining.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. It's wonderful to see you.
Wonderful.
I saw your show with Mary. Yeah. And the boys were around. I missed them.
Right. They're not here today, or they're not here now. They're in school. So.
Okay. Well, look, you take care of yourself.
You too. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye.